Hi everyone. We're just waiting for a couple of people still to join before we kick off the webinar. So if you bear with us for a few more minutes, we'll just let everyone join and then we'll get started. Thank you. Hi and welcome to our webinar today. Today we'll be looking at designing for an emergency, and Alper is going to give us a glimpse into an emergency use situation from his own perspective. Before we do get started, I'm just going to give a little bit of an introduction. So we are very excited today to share reflections and practical insights that you can apply directly to your own work. Feel free throughout the session to provide questions and we will do our best to provide answers. If we do end up going over time and we have not answered your question, we will aim to do so via email. So please do bring those questions. We're more than happy to answer them. Alper, who is our presenter today, has 25 years of experience as a specialist qualitative researcher. He originally started out in the government social sector and then moved into health policy research and has spent the last 13 years specializing within medical device research. We are very fortunate to have Alper as part of our team here at Clarimed, and he's involved in all the different stages of product design research, ranging from early stage ideation right through to post-market insight. So his insights and knowledge and experience are extremely valuable to our team. He also has partnered with clients to ensure that their business objectives are met, and he does this very successfully on a day-to-day basis. So without further ado, I welcome Alper to present on this wonderful webinar. So thank you.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you very, very, very much, Jess, for the introduction. Well, just really to start off, as Jess mentioned, I know we've allotted up to an hour for this, but I think it will probably take slightly shy of that. So we'll have time for plenty of questions if you have any. So what I'll be doing for the next maybe half an hour is really reflecting on how we go about assisting, facilitating clients to design products for emergency use. And I'll be doing that or reflecting from two perspectives. Firstly, from the perspective of someone who's been working in the industry in maybe 16, 17 odd years, informing the design, development of such products, and also exploring unmet needs. But also from the perspective as a parent, a father who not so long ago was in the unfortunate position of having to administer emergency care to my son. So I thought it'd be useful just to set the scene so you get a feel for what happens, and then we'll build on that to think about maybe what we should be considering and why. So as far as setting the scene, imagine it's say 3 o'clock in the morning. Okay, I'm rudely awakened by loud, frantic, continuous glucose monitor alerts. Essentially, it's a siren. I'd been fast asleep prior to that. I stumble out of bed, make my way in a dark room, out of the room, across the hallway, the landing, into my youngest rooms. Alerts are going off. And just to add, it's not uncommon for alerts to go off nocturnally. You normally just go in, hand some Lucozade over, and the situation is quite quickly sorted. But in this instance, I put the light on, saw him laying in bed, went to wake him, and noticed that I wasn't being that successful, which isn't uncommon. It's early in the morning. Continue to try and awaken him. And then after maybe 10, 20 seconds, he stretched out. So I thought, great, he's waking up. We can give him some sugar. And then that stretch turned into more of a contorted posture. And he stretched out. His jaw became very contorted. And then there are all sorts of rather frightening noises and frothing, and then there was a full-on seizure, which I'd never encountered before, like a lot of people. So he's seizuring, I pick him up, he's seizuring, hand him across to my wife, and at that moment, the seizuring stops in an instant, head rolls back, and there's silence. So like any person or parent, and in that moment, you kind of think the worst, understandably. And also in that moment, I realized, which I had realized prior to that, but in that moment, I realized we need to do something and we need to do it quickly. And that need to do involved a glucagon pen or injection. So what I'd like to do is kind of reflect on that experience and think about what more, if anything, we can actually do to further enable medical device companies to develop even more usable and appropriate devices for situations like that. And there's no suggestion on my part that we're not doing a great job, but I think an even better job potentially can be done. And it's really along those lines that I'd like to talk. So I thought a good starting point might be to think about the type of environment in which we are generally asking participants, whether that's a carer or someone living with a condition, but the type of environment we're generally asking them to handle medical devices, including emergency use devices. And obviously this environment that you see in front of you here is a viewing facility, just a random viewing facility here. And we'll use this both sometimes for earlier stage research when we're exploring unmet needs, maybe when we're asking participants to handle early stage, mid-stage prototypes, or also when we're carrying out a summative session. But if we think about those sessions, they generally go along the following lines. Initially, there's the scene setting. So I'm sat there, or we're sat there as a moderator, participants are sat there, they'll have whatever devices or maybe accessories or instructions in front of them. And there'll be some scene setting up front so they know why they're there and the purpose of the research. And then some additional scene setting, maybe once we've established rapport and learned more a bit about them. And that further scene setting is really the fundamental of that session, whereby we explain to them what we'd like them to imagine. So in this instance, it might be something along the lines of, I'd like you to imagine that you walked in on your son in the early hours and you've noticed his seizuring and you realize that the time has come for you to treat that seizure, or to treat your son, whatever terminology you wish to use. And then beyond that, what we'll often say is, okay, so in a moment, I'd like you to deliver treatment as quickly as possible. And there may be some other things we might say, maybe adding a specific time, a quantifiable time to that activity. So the scene is set, but also importantly, the urgency is established as well. And obviously within that room, we'll do as much as possible to simulate the type of environment that someone will be in, potentially, if this were a real life situation. So there'll be the tweaking of lighting, there may be a mannequin, there'll be other distractions. There might be a TV going on in the background. There might be the sound of children playing. Just lots of other variables and factors to add to that sense of realism. And there are also other arguably unavoidable variables. There'll be myself. There might be a note taker. More than often, there'll be a one-way mirror. Clients behind there. You might have 1, 2 video cameras, hidden microphones. There's a lot going on. And as you just heard a moment ago, not so long ago, I was in this situation. I was having to use a device in an emergency. But the key difference here was that I wasn't being paid to do that, like a participant. I hadn't been showered maybe with refreshments prior to the session. And unlike a participant, I knew that if I got it wrong, there would be repercussions, which obviously is not something any participant would feel to any extent in that type of situation. So this is what I was dealing with. This is a glucagon pen. And as it says, it's pretty clear, and it looks pretty easy to use as far as a device is concerned. You've got bright orange casing, container, packaging, which makes it super easy to identify in a rush. I mean, if you look at it, there are two components. You've got the syringe. You don't even have to attach the needle. It's pre-attached. And there's a vial. You're simply inserting the syringe into the vial and drawing up. And there are 4 clear steps, diagrammatically illustrated, again, which should make it really easy. So what could be any easier, bearing in mind that I've been in med devices for quite a while. I've seen many IFUs, many devices, unlike most, if not all, participants. I was in the comfort of my own home, familiar surroundings. Yes, it was very early and I was slightly tired and disorientated, but yet a very familiar environment, unlike most participants. I'd also been trained on how to use this. Granted, it was 7 odd years ago, but I've been trained by a DSN, by a diabetes specialist nurse, unlike most participants. Obviously, there are some situations where they're trained, but for something like this, depending on the nature of the study, often they won't be, and we're just handing it over just to assess its intuitiveness and to see how handling works out. And unlike for a participant, most participants, this device was out, it's in the market, on the market, a lot of money's been thrown at it. It's been refined both in product design and IFU design and structure. So why then did I falter when I was handling this? I mean, by no means, there wasn't a use error, but most definitely if I'd been in a simulated environment, in a viewing facility being moderated, there most definitely would have been, a use difficulty would have been logged. Let's just say it like that. So why did I falter? And it really got me thinking after that experience, maybe a week or 2 after, what was going on there? And why did it feel so incredibly different to the environments that we simulate when we're carrying out research? And let's be honest, and as I've kind of alluded to just a second ago, what I experienced and what millions of other people experience in that situation, such as using a glucagon pen, couldn't have been any further removed from what a participant experiences in the moment. It bore no resemblance whatsoever, apart from having the physical device in front of you and having to use it. Beyond that, completely polarized experiences. And it got me thinking, well, what was going on there? What were the differences? Why were there differences? And how do those impact? I'm not the best at coming up with acronym, but came up with beach. And I kind of thought the irony there was beaches are very relaxing on the whole. If you like beaches, but my experience was far from relaxing. So what was going on for me, and it might just be unique to me, but I'd imagine not so, were a number of demands, strains, and pressures. First, and not in any order of importance or occurrence, but it's bravery. In the moment, I realized I needed to do something, and that was to essentially inject my son into the thigh with what looked like a pretty large needle. And instinctively, I thought, I don't want to do this, I can't do it, but realizing I have to. And in all honesty, I handed that over to my wife to do while I phoned emergency services. You've got a huge amount of emotion and emotional turbulence going on. As I mentioned, his head rolled back, silent, and I instinctively thought, there we go. That's kind of it. Having never been exposed to someone seizuring and not really knowing huge amounts about the physiology of seizuring. And I know that they can end badly depending on the nature and length of seizure, and his seizure was quite long. And in the moment, I thought, we can't lose him, and B, have we lost him, or are we on the road to losing him? So you've got the need for bravery, that incredibly turbulent emotional experience too. And then along with the bravery and the emotion, you need help. I mean, I live quite rurally, so it takes a while for ambulances to arrive. So while my wife was about to inject, I phoned the emergency services by her side. There's also comprehension for both of us, looking at this device, opening the packaging, seeing the instructions, only 4 steps. It should be super easy. But in the moment, even though they look easy, you're essentially just reading just to make sure that you don't make any errors. And physiologically, for me, it was the equivalent of having drunk multiple Red Bulls. Your heart is pounding. You're trying to keep calm, but yet your heart is pounding and fighting against all rationality, comprehension, and just making that emotional turbulence and the need to be brave even more challenging. And look, I'm not criticizing what we do. We do a good job, and we do as good a job, I think, that we can at the moment. But I think there is room for improvement. And I think also, hand on heart, there's only so far that we can go towards accurately simulating an emergency. And I think we need to accept that and be honest with ourselves. There's only so much within the realms of ethics and acceptability that we can go to put a participant in a situation without triggering a negative emotional, psychological, physiological reaction in them. Having said that, I think what we can and most definitely need to do is look a lot further. And when I say look a lot further, what I'm thinking here is looking beyond the regulation, not disregarding it, obviously, but looking beyond the regulation, looking beyond the physical device, looking beyond the packaging, looking beyond the IFU to truly understand those lived experiences of people handling a device in an emergency. And yes, I'll be talking, my reference point is a glucagon pen, type 1 diabetes, acute hypoglycemia, but I'd like to think that a lot of what I'm discussing here and considering is applicable to most, if not all, emergency use devices. So what's needed? What, in my view, do we need to do? And again, all of this is up for discussion and debate. I think primarily we need to learn a lot more. Just where diabetes and type 1 diabetes is concerned and hyperglycemia. Not so long ago, the American Diabetes Association concluded that we have an acutely inadequate understanding of the experiences and emotions of people using glucagon pens. For me, that rang alarm bells. They've been around long enough. And the diabetes space, it particularly is pretty active on the research front, not just medical device and pharma companies, but also people within the community living with and caring for people with type 1 diabetes. There's a lot that goes on online and sharing, but yet, according to the ADA, our understanding is relatively limited. So what do we need to do? And I think the solution here is relatively simple in that, yes, we do carry out early stage research. I know it goes on and there's a lot of that, but I think there needs to be a lot more of that. Using more dynamic, elaborate, delving techniques, whether that's in person, ethnographic, using other technologies such as emotion tracking, eye tracking, AI simulation, to really dig a lot deeper to understand not just what goes on physiologically, but the emotional, the cognitive, the psychological dynamics that are present in that moment, to really understand what that lived experience looks like, feels like, and the repercussions that that has on the end user. So what does the FDA have to say? So the FDA describes the use environment as the actual conditions and settings in which the user interacts with the medical device. And according to them, understandably, it's important we simulate the key characteristics. I've highlighted key characteristics here, such as lighting, sound levels, distractions, other personnel and equipment present during use of the subject device. This is all well and good, and this is what we do. But I think we need to do a lot more. And of course, we do this and we try to do a lot more to evoke that sense of urgency, to trigger that sense of needing to use a device quickly, as you generally have to do in an emergency. But I think we need to look a lot further beyond these physical considerations, because yes, someone in an emergency will have certain emotional, psychological, cognitive responses that are triggered by those physiological circumstances, such as the lighting, such as the TV going, not being able to concentrate. But there are plenty of psychological, physiological, emotional, and cognitive dynamics going on in an emergency that are triggered not so much by the physical environment, but are triggered simply by being in the moment. And in the moment can take place for different people in different environments. So it's about understanding what that moment looks like, firstly, and secondly, how the moment, being present in that moment, impacts on how people handle devices in an emergency. So what do we need to do? And I've got a few slides here, just, I guess, almost spitballing, thinking about what is it we need to do and how can we do it? And these are very much just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more that could be discussed that would take way longer than the time that we have. But if we think about type 1 diabetes, again, this is the reference point, and what it's like for someone who lives with type 1 diabetes experiencing an acute hyperglycemic episode, or even for someone caring for that person. But if we think about the individual living with type 1, in a hypo, there's all sorts going on, as you may or may not be aware. You've got this, depending on the level of your blood glucose, you've got this primal hunger. You've got potentially dizziness, blurred vision, quite significant, very, very significant, significantly impaired cognition, emotions. There's a huge amount. Going on. And I guess what we need to do, both for the carers and also for people living with conditions, is maybe just get a teeny bit closer to simulating the dynamics of what goes on for them in that scenario. So there are lots of things we can do. Obviously, someone experiencing this in an episode will be dizzy and maybe slightly disorientated. And there are things we can begin to do to evoke those sensations and to create and trigger mild vestibular disturbances. One way is having a screen, rotating stripes, rotating dots, maybe 15, 20 seconds, which again creates that low-level sense of disorientation. As I've hopefully got across, that situation in emergencies presents a huge cognitive, emotional, psychological load, stress on the participants. And again, of course, we need to be careful with how we begin to get anywhere near simulating that. But there are many techniques that can be adopted to get someone slightly closer, not necessarily on the complete edge, but to increase that cognitive load and stress level. One of which, and there are many, many out there, is the Stroop task. And essentially, this is a paced and timed activity where you're asking a participant to name the color of a color word. So it might be blue, B-L-U-E, but that's written in purple font. So when they see the color word, they need to say purple, which sounds pretty easy. But if you're pressurizing someone to do that in quite rapidly, that causes a certain amount of stress. Of course, ethics is important regardless of the nature of the study. And with these types of techniques, the kind of informed consent procedure, the ethics review process is even more detailed and elaborate, just to ensure that we're safeguarding participants, both physiologically, emotionally, psychologically. So we never lose sight of that, of course. But what I'm saying is there are lots of techniques that most definitely can be adopted just to move a participant nearer to the reality of what they may be experiencing. And as I said before, we'll never be able to simulate it beautifully and accurately, but we can move a step further. I think also what dawned on me is, I guess, thinking about designing beyond the physical device. We're social and emotional beings, and the way we react in an emergency has a lot to do with our emotions, with our cognition, with our psychology. And I think what's important in that sense is for us to empathize a lot more with what people go through in an emergency scenario. And again, what's needed. And it wasn't so, maybe a few months ago, I was talking to a colleague of mine, and his words were that the empathy is the human race's greatest achievement. And it got me thinking. And I think that's undeniable. There are no other mammals that empathize in the way that we are able to. And it got me questioning, well, if that's the case, to what extent does empathy inform the design of products? And yes, it does to a certain extent, but equally, I think there's a huge amount more that could be done by way of factoring in empathy in the design and development of products, packaging, devices, and IFUs. And it wasn't so long actually after the seizure event that I saw an instructional video by a diabetes specialist nurse, which had a huge impact on me, not only in terms of the clarity of the instructions, but also in terms of the nature of the extent to which it was so comforting. And again, triggered me to think, why in the moment can't instructions be more like that? As well as providing the logical statements, there needs to be more to them than that. And again, thinking beyond that, and I'm not suggesting this is the way forward. If you think about birthday cards, you can pick up a birthday card for £1, under £1, that has a chip in that talks through, verbalizes a greeting. Goodness, you can actually record your own greeting into a birthday card. And again, I'm not suggesting this is what needs to be incorporated into med device design for emergency devices, but I thought, is there something there? Imagine having instructions as well as the IFU, but verbalized instructions in your own voice that you've pre-recorded. What, if any, impact would that have in terms of directing and calming someone to use a particular device in an emergency? And if we look at IFUs as well, yes, they're generally what you see are logical statements. Logical statements and instructions: remove the cap, insert the syringe into the vial, etc., dispose of device. But what's often missing are more emotional statements. So not just a logical guidance, but emotional guidance. And these can work hand in hand and can be very, very impactful. When I mention or talk about emotional guidance, what I'm thinking of here are statements similar to what the nurse said actually in this training video that were impactful. So statements such as, I know it looks frightening, but they won't remember what occurred. And that's true. If someone's in a seizure, having a seizure, they won't remember anything. Or statements such as, I know it's frightening, but that's to be expected. Again, these are obvious statements, but quite calming. And another concern, the syringe itself, which went along the lines of, don't worry if you see air bubbles in the syringe, as long as you've drawn up all of the liquid, that's fine. So what I'm suggesting here is there needs to be more of that hand in hand with logical guidance to handhold and calm and empower end users to use devices as intended correctly. So samples without boundaries. As I pointed out earlier, I think people most definitely experience an emergency and interpret and respond to an emergency in different ways, quite significantly different, which makes designing for an emergency challenging, of course. But I think there's a lot more that we can do to ensure that we factor that in, thinking primarily about the type of participants and the broadness and the scope of participants that we include in our studies. Because there are different realities, different interpretations, and we need to do as much as possible to ensure our samples are diverse beyond the type of diversity quotas that we generally as in industry have. So one point here is when we think about cultural differences, and there's a lot of evidence and documentation around low and high context cultures. And this is particularly important when you think about how end users interpret, make sense of, and follow instructions that accompany documents. Devices. So if you think about low context culture, so we're thinking here about the UK, for example, and there's strong evidence there that highlights that in low context cultures such as UK and other parts of Europe, people generally respond relatively well to quick, short, isolated, even quite abrupt instructions. Whereas if you compare that to high context cultures, thinking about China, Japan, South Korea, and other such markets, instructions generally work better when they're contextualized, where there are more culturally sensitive cues within those instructions. And there are lots of ways that can be done respectfully, including the most basic approach, which would be at the start of an instruction, simply saying, when you're ready, I would like you to, and then follow through. So there's a lot more cultural sensitivity and etiquette that needs to be incorporated for instructions that are aimed at high context markets. Literacy, as we know, literacy health is so varied, and I've lost count a number of times I've seen instructions that use terminology or expressions that a number of people I know would not engage well with, or maybe not understand. So I think we need to go even a step further to ensure that samples will include the diverse spectrum of health literacy, so that we're testing products more accurately. Cognition, I've spoken about this a lot, that people have varying levels, varying types of working memory, processing speed, metacognition. And when we talk about metacognition, we're thinking here about to what extent people know what they know. So whether someone recognizes whether or not they've understood an instruction, or whether someone recognizes that they need to reread an instruction. And there are lots of ways that this can be assessed during the participant screening process before deciding who to include in a study. Learning style preferences, there are visual, auditory, kinesthetic learners. Again, we need to factor this in, especially when we think about auditory learners and preferences, when we think about IFUs and whether they're verbalized, which I mentioned earlier. And then the classic of dexterity, which is one of the many that we do factor in more than often when asking people to handle devices. So there's a lot that we do, but I think there's a lot more that we could do just to ensure that we're capturing and catering for those different approaches and different perceptions and different realities that people experience when they're grappling with a device in an emergency. I did say this would be relatively short, but I just thought I'd leave us with the words of this guy. So this is Alfred Adler, who's the founder of the School of Individual Psychology. And as he said, and I'll read it, empathy is seeing with the eyes of another, listening with the ears of another, and feeling with the heart of another. And I think for me, this sums it up beautifully. And it's about seeing and appreciating things through another lens, understanding and empathizing, and not just focusing on the regulatory, the physical, but looking way beyond that to ensure that med device development at every stage is underpinned by this empathy and is underpinned by a full appreciation of the lived experiences of the intended users. And that brings us to the end of the webinar. So thank you all for joining.
Thank you, Alper. That was very insightful. Just having a look to see if we've got any questions coming from anyone in the audience. If anyone does have any questions, please do send them through. One question that I'd like to pose to you is, how in a simulated use environment would one really try and hone in on that emotional response that you spoke about? And I think in some instances and for some individuals that can become quite paralyzing. Some thrive in those situations, others don't necessarily thrive, but they know that there is an utmost need to intervene. So how can one simulate that within a test environment, but do so safely for that participant, so that the situation that you're putting them into in that use environment within that test scenario is not going to flow over into their lives following that session that they have?
Absolutely. I think that this, as I've kind of alluded to throughout, this is the challenge. Even if we understand absolutely beautifully the kind of experiences, the dynamics of an emergency, there's only so much that we can do to conjure up those dynamics and simulate that. And obviously for us, the priority is to safeguard participants. And part of that is not only how we structure and simulate a session, but obviously the informed consents around that. And I think there's a middle ground there, which kind of links to some of the strategies I mentioned in terms of the vestibular disturbances, the low-level stressing techniques, but obviously pitching them correctly. So yes, we can we can trigger a greater sense of urgency and cognitive stress without leaving participants in complete turmoil and having an impact outside of the room. Because obviously our intention fundamentally is that people leave the session in the same physiological and emotional state as they did arriving into the session, if not in a more positive state.
Thank you for that.
I know we had a few queries. Oh, sorry, Jess. Just say, I know we had a few queries come in prior to the webinar, which I tweaked slides just to account for and hopefully answer. So I'm assuming that we've done that, as there are no further queries.
Brilliant. Thank you. Let me just have a look. So we have had a question come through. The question is, how far would you go with the props in such simulations? Would you, for example, use fake blood to trigger reactions with participants?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think approaches like that are great and fantastic, which are just nudging slightly nearer to the reality of the emergency. Again, what's key here is that these are covered off in the informed consent documentation and process. And I think regardless of the study, but especially for studies like this, I think if we need to think outside the box when it comes to informed consent, and we do this a lot, and some companies do, others don't. But often with a study like a study that's focusing on emergency use, yes, you need the documentation, but I think that things like having a video that accompanies that documentation can be quite empowering for potential participants and can help allay any fears, especially if they're meeting the project team and we're kind of introducing not just who we are, so they're putting a face to the name, but also introducing the purpose of the research and giving them a feel for the types of things that they'll be encountering, which again just gets them into the zone and ensures they're going in eyes wide open, and also ensures that when they go in, they're not freaking out when they're presented with what will be seen as an alarming scenario. So just to communicate the fact that there will be an effort to simulate what might be whatever the emergency scenario is.
Yeah, and I think nowadays you get quite good simulated mannequins and things like that that do look
Yes.
relatively realistic. So I think giving participants a heads up on that does,
Yeah,
in a way, just
completely.
prep them
Completely. I mean,
for what they're going to
I'm
be
definitely
faced with.
aware of, obviously mannequins are used widespread, but I'm most definitely aware of real life humans being used in place of a mannequin, depending on the nature of the study, which most definitely adds an additional significant sense of realism.
Yeah. And it goes without saying that ethical approval is definitely something you'd pursue in all of these
Yes,
scenarios to make sure that you're ticking all of
absolutely.
those boxes. Um,
Absolutely.
one other question that has come to mind is with regards to the two different cultures that you mentioned, so the low context and the high context culture, given
Mhm.
the multicultural environments that we're now faced with, thanks to air travel and immigration and all of that, how can one ensure that when one is testing in one geographical location like the UK, that
Mhm.
one is really tapping into those different cultures
Mhm.
equally so that you are giving a good understanding, particularly in the instance where a client is perhaps not looking to test beyond just one geographical location?
Mhm.
What is your approach there, particularly from an emergency use scenario and the
Yeah,
methods?
I think there are a number of approaches. I think having a diverse research team as we do is critically important. Um, Most definitely diversity as part of the research team provides that different perspective, that lens, that appreciation. And as with most companies, we're carrying out research globally across all sorts of markets, and there's a huge amount of difference and diversity there. And what's important when we're partnering maybe with participant recruiters, if we're carrying out research in Japan or we're working with associates that we have in those markets, is that we're capitalizing on our colleagues out there, their know-how, their market knowledge, their deep understanding and appreciation of those cultural nuances, which we have as a team, of course, but then having those additional insights on the ground will add to how projects are designed and the type, even the way that we run sessions will have a generally tweaked depending on which market that we're moderating in.
Fantastic, thank you. Just double check to see if there are any other questions coming through. Um, if there are no further questions, I think that concludes our webinar for today. Just double check. You can never be too sure. Open up the other chat. Um, but yeah, thank you so much, Alpa. This has been
Pleasure.
really insightful. And it's unfortunate, but also really awesome to see that you've taken this personal experience and turned it into something that gives you the reflection, but also the opportunity to share that with everyone. So
Agreed.
thank you. Thank you very much. And
Pleasure.
thank you for everyone attending. It's been a wonderful
Absolutely.
webinar.
Great
Yeah,
stuff.
thank you.
Super. We'll take care.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Bye bye.